good news you can use with Deb Mahone, yeah. She got the good news you can use. Good news you can use for your life.
Hello again and welcome to this edition of The Boomer Beat. I am your host, Beverly Mahone, and today we are going to talk about color and how color can influence your life. Now, don't go down that road. This is not a race issue. We are talking about vibrant color. And who better to join me for this conversation than the man who is going to explain what color means in your life? Is Carl Nordgren. Yes. Hey, Carl, how are you today?
Hey, Beverly, I'm fine. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
And you know, folks, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but Carl and I met in a very unusual way. We both live in the same area, but had never met. But we met through a third party. But we'll be talking about that on down the road when he explains his 3 F's. So we're talking about colors and 3 F's, and they're not the words you think they are, okay?
No,
Although I've used some of those words over the past week.
Yeah,
but
my topic is PG as it gets.
Okay. So, Carl, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about your background?
I will do that. And a couple of things that will maybe most immediately mean something to folks is up until about 4 years ago, I spent the previous 14 years teaching courses at Duke University to undergraduates, initially in courses on how to start a business, but those courses very quickly morphed into what I mostly taught when I was there, which were courses that were designed to help a student grow their creative capacity, develop their entrepreneurial instincts. I like to link those two words, that they will become their most creatively entrepreneurial selves. And the reason I would link those two words, especially early on in my work at Duke, was that in those days, it was still very common for somebody to say to themselves, hey, I'm not artistic and therefore I'm not creative. And people would say, hey, I haven't never started a business and therefore I'm not entrepreneurial. And my proposition is that the health of us individually, the health of our communities, the health of our nation will really benefit from as many people as possible seeing themselves as creative and as entrepreneurial. So I linked those two words and urged people to become creatively entrepreneurial to sort of give a refresh, right? To give people permission to think anew about what that language might mean. So I taught at Duke for all those years. The reason why I was invited to teach at Duke in a class in entrepreneurship is that prior to that, I'd spent about 25, 30 years as what is often referred to as a serial entrepreneur. I had a hand in starting about a dozen companies of one sort or another, sometimes leading this team, sometimes assisting the leaders. I had a hand in starting the very first cellular telephone company here in the Triangle back in 1985. Cellular, one of the Triangle. Us boomers remember that cellular was introduced as a local market business, and we had the license for the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill business. Folks who are familiar with the Chapel Hill scene might remember a marketing company called FGI. I was the partner and CEO of FGI, a marketing services company that at one point, except for the university itself, was the largest employer in Chapel Hill. And then I spent a big part of the 90s, Beverly, helping first-time entrepreneurs launch their businesses, helping them create the right story for what it is that they were trying to do, helping them find the right proposition with the marketplace, helping them recruit creative people. But the common thread throughout all this, Beverly, is that my fascination has always been with the fact that everywhere I look, I see extraordinarily creative people. And because I'm aware of this, because I've made it my intention, I help creative people become more creative and do a better job of developing and applying their creative abilities. And that's been sort of the common thread through all the work that I've done. Here now, I'm starting a new company. If we want to, I've been talking here for a while, so let me stop. But if we want to talk about that, I'd be delighted to talk about that new company that we're just getting ready to launch as well.
We can talk about that on down the road. Absolutely. Sure. I do want to share that. So you talked about creativity and teaching students at Duke. And for my UNC fans, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I didn't do my research well enough. Actually, I got to issue that disclaimer, okay? And NC State fans, I really feel bad. Okay, so with that being said, you talked about creativity, you talked about entrepreneurship, and you talked about Duke students, which would tend to be, in the range of 18 to 23, give or take a year or two.
Right.
Now, can that same creativity and entrepreneurial mindset be passed on to our generation?
Absolutely.
And how does that work?
Absolutely. One of the things, one of the insights that's been really informing my work of late, since I left Duke about 4 years ago, I work with businesses and lots of different organizations, nonprofits, the public itself, doing workshops and programs designed to help people become creative and entrepreneurial. And a couple of years ago, I was asked by a friend to do a program for the 55 plus market. In this particular case, the 55 plus people who were trying to get back into the workplace. Maybe they had retired too soon, or they were just maybe trying to refresh their careers. And so he asked me to come and do some creativity workshops for a big Saturday event that he had for this cohort. And I thought, well, I've never intentionally delivered my content to that mature audience. And so I did a little bit of research, and Beverly, I was just blown away by what I found. I found 3 major neuroscience studies that identify significant biological changes that occur in a 55 plus brain, and those changes result in that brain being more creative. And so we are actually positioned because of these changes. And I'll mention, I'll talk about one of them just to give an example. But
well, I want to just interject something and say that I read your blog post about that.
Yeah.
And I was really intrigued. And I was like, wow, this is deep. I didn't know. So I would like you, if you would, to really go through all of that.
Great. Okay, wonderful. I'll be happy to do that. So our brain is composed, we talk about gray matter for our brains, right? That's all the neurons that are doing cognitive thinking for us. There's also white matter. And up until a couple of decades ago, white matter was believed to be just sort of a fatty substance that just sort of holds the gray matter together, right? It's sort of structural integrity. It was the purpose of white matter. Well, we've learned now that it isn't that. It's much, 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 much more than that. White matter is primarily made up of a fatty substance that's called myelin, and myelin coats like a electric wire gets coated with plastic. Myelin coats the connections between our various neurons. What myelin does when it coats these connections is it actually accelerates the transmission of data, of impulses between the neurons. So each time there's a coat of myelin that gets laid down, the performance of your brain improves with each layer of myelin that gets laid down. Well, myelination, when we're born, we have very little of it. Initially, it focuses on our motor control areas and our sensory control areas, which makes sense, right? An infant child should be really good at motor control and really good at reading the environment around them really quickly. So it focuses initially on those 2 areas of the brain. Eventually, it gets to the prefrontal cortex. Not till we're in our adolescence does the first myelination occur in our prefrontal cortex. Well, then wave after wave after wave occurs, focusing on the prefrontal cortex to the point where we're about 55 or so, myelination finally becomes complete. The neuroscientist who identified this process, he's from UCLA, he says that when that process completes, our brain is communicating with itself more effectively, more efficiently than it ever has before, more completely than it ever has before, because again, each layer of myelin improves the transmission of the brain within itself. So the quote that Dr. Bartzakis uses when he describes his research is that there is a biological explanation for wisdom, right? There is a biological explanation for wisdom that finally at somewhere around our mature 55 age, and it continues, we are now able to process our thoughts and our thinking and our experiences much more completely, much more thoroughly, much more effectively than we could before. So that's just one study, which all by itself is pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, it is. And I guess, when you talk about all of a sudden we gain this wisdom, is that because our brain is able to go back through all of the mistakes and errors that we made, and then all of a sudden now we realize that, huh,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
really the way it's supposed to be done.
We're processing a new, we're comparing understandings that we never had before are being related to each other. Experiences that have never been related to each other are being related to each other, and new appreciations for what we learned from our life become available to us.
And that happens around the age of 55.
And you don't have to do a thing about it. Your brain is just doing that for you, right? You don't have to be intentional. I'm a big nut on being intentional, right? Be intentionally creative. You don't have to be intentional with this one. It just happens to you. The other quote that he used to describe the effect of this on us, this neuroscientist, Bartzakis, is that it's like your brain goes from dial-up internet to high speed. That's the kind of change that occurs. So there's one of them.
I can understand that. Okay.
So here's the second one. The second one is that when neuroscientists first began to plot where thought takes place, what kind of thought takes place where in our brains, right? They first saw the right hemisphere as the creative side, and they saw the left hemisphere as the rational, logical side. And we all thought, okay, we got to get into our right hemispheres to be creative, and we're being logical and analytical and linear when we're in our left hemispheres. Well, there's truth to that. But the bigger truth, if you want to get into your best creative mind, right? If you want to get into the creative version of your mindset, to use your phrase, that is going to be the most optimal for us to solve problems and come up with ideas, well, you want your two hemispheres integrated. You want the intuitive dancing with the rational. You want the nonlinear playing with the logical. Well, a researcher from just down the street at Duke University, excuse me, UNC folk, but from Duke University, a researcher named Dr. Cabeza, set up the following study. He developed a series of 4 or 5 high-level questions, math questions, sensory questions, spatial questions, that would cause somebody to really have to, think and cognitive about answering these. And he created 2 study groups. Brand new college students were asked these questions when they were in an MRI so that they could have their brains being studied while they were answering these questions. And then high functioning seniors. I'm sure all the people who would pull in, who watch your wonderful podcast, they all fit the description of high functioning seniors, 55 and older, who aren't suffering from any sort of early, mental fatigue problems. So those are the 2 groups. The college students, when they solve these problems, solve them with a very local, very specific portion of their brain, depending upon what the problem is. When these high functioning seniors solve these exact same problems, they're using their whole brains. Their whole brains more naturally integrate with each other to solve a problem. Again, we don't have to do a thing about it. Being mindful of it and being aware of it should give us confidence that now is the time to go engage in a creative renewal in our life, because these biological changes, one of which is making our brain communicate with itself more effectively because of the myelination, the other allowing the brains to all aspects of our cognition, right? When you can be looking at a problem and using both your intuitive mind as well as your rational mind to come up with a solution for that, wow, you're much more likely to come up with an exciting solution. So those are 2 places where a 55 plus brain just begs for you to become more creative in your life because it's ready to support that.
But that's not always the case, though. I mean, while I agree with you, sometimes the intuitive mind may just really be there, but the rational mind is not quite there, or vice versa. The rational mind may be there, but the intuitive part of it is not. So, so it's not just that it just happens automatically for everybody.
No, it doesn't happen automatically. I mean, it doesn't happen automatically for everybody. And even for people who are 55 plus, it won't happen automatically. It's much more likely to happen for you when you're 55 plus. If you had any inclination in that direction at all, it will be even greater. If you had no inclination, you'll be appreciating it for the first time. And I won't guarantee you that it will be there for you each and every time. There are some exercises that you can do. One of the best exercises that you can do, because it's so simple to do, to integrate the 2 hemispheres of your brain, is to walk. Research out of the University of Stanford shows that about the time their phrase is natural stride. You know what your natural stride is. You can feel it, right? When you're in your natural stride, when you reach your natural stride and maintain it for just a couple of minutes, your two hemispheres of your brain begin to integrate.
And that is so amazing because some of my best ideas have come when I've been on my walks.
Yep.
I mean, it's like I'm communed with nature.
Yep.
There's nothing else there but me and, my creator and just what's around me. And then all of a sudden these ideas start coming, and then I try to get in the car and write them down when I, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. So now let me ask this question because you bring up something that I think, and I read this on your blog about crystal intelligence.
Right.
So I'm 60 years old, give or take. I'm not going to tell me. Anyway, I'm 60 years old and I'm thinking about running a marathon. In my earlier years, I was athletic, did all of those things. But over time you kind of stop, you become sedate somewhat. Is there something in my brain that will trigger me to say, okay, you've got this, go do this, and give me those tools that I need in order to accomplish that goal?
Well, there are. I mean, my guess is that when we reach the age of 60, we have a good understanding of who we are, right? We've got all these data points that we've been processing all of our lives, of all of our experiences, that somewhere around there. And again, crystallized intelligence, which you've referenced, and I made a mistake in that blog. I called it crystal intelligence. The proper phrase for it is crystallized intelligence. That because of myelination, let me take a half step back. Social scientists have known for 3 or 4 decades that when we reach the age of 55, we get much better at understanding who we are. And that's what they've been calling our crystallized intelligence. Now we know why it gets better. It's because myelination has finally completed itself, and because the two hemispheres are working together. And so, that's a quick little note on crystallized intelligence. To talk about, when do you know? Because you've got better crystallized intelligence, you understand much better than you ever did before. What are the behaviors that you really like to do, right? Do you like to analyze, or do you like to be an empathetic person, right? Who wants to deal with people, or do you like to be a collaborator whose job, how do you approach the world? How do you approach, what's the attitude that you look at the world? We know when we're around 60 years old, 55 to 60, do we get a much, much better sense of how we want to perform and how we want to behave in the world. Well, to answer your question, when you are in that place, right? When you are doing the stuff that you really love to do, that's when you should query yourself as to whether or not you want to take on that kind of a massive challenge. Because when you're in that state, I'm an intuitive guy. Right. I make my judgments based on my gut reactions much more than I make my judgments based on any logical sequence that I'll take something through. Right.
I'm that way too. And I thought that was a bad thing, but okay.
No, it's not.
I'm good with that.
What I've learned, and maybe you have as well, is that I have to bring some logic to it after the fact if I want somebody else to pay attention to it. Right. I can't expect them to follow my intuitive leap. I trust my intuitive leap. I can't expect anybody else to trust my intuitive leap, so I'll try to rationalize it for them afterwards. But when you're in that place where you are doing what you're meant to do, your brain is in its optimal state when that's happening, and that's when you should query it for what kind of challenges are you ready to take on. Because when it is really in its optimal state, it understands itself, it understands you, it understands who you are so much more completely than it does at any other point, right? When you're frustrated, and I get frustrated when somebody asks me to analyze too much stuff, right? I'm not an analytical person. So if I have a task that's filled with me having to analyze stuff, I get frustrated. Well, at that point in time, I don't want to query my brain about what is it that I should be doing with the rest of my life, because my brain is barely getting by with what it is I'm asking it to do. But when I'm calling on my brain to do exactly what my brain loves to do, and I catch myself in that moment, boy, that's when I want to challenge myself to see, am I really ready to take on writing a new book? Am I really ready to take on running a marathon? You know, my brain will know better than it will ever know at that point what, you know, what the true authentic answer for me is.
That's very interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
so this now leads me to the colors.
Okay. All right.
Because you and I, when we met via a mutual friend. She was talking about the name of your book, and
Right.
it's called "Becoming a Creative Genius Again."
Right.
And she pointed out the fact, as well as you, that green is the color of creativity.
Right. Right.
And I,
Yeah.
I always thought, like I said to you, it was red.
Right.
So explain the concept of green as it relates to creativity
Great.
and, you know, this book that you've written and how this all comes together.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, because it's one of my favorite pieces of research to talk about, because the result of it is such an easy thing for us to do. It's the research is out of the University of Munich. It was well publicized. If you were to Google University of Munich green research, you'll find a whole lot of both academic as well as popular articles written about this research. What they did was they were very, very ambitious. Most researchers who are studying the changes of our creative mind use one very specific creative problem for you to solve, and you know, for them to measure you solving this problem. The University of Munich researchers developed four very discrete, very different creative challenges, right? One that is about finding lots of solutions to a problem, one that's about measuring how intuitive you are, one that's how good you are at pattern recognition. I forget now what the fourth one was, but four very different, very important creative processes were being tested. And we all know how this research works, right? They first bring in the control group. They do the four exercises without looking at any color. Then they brought in a group that looked at the color, I'm sorry to say this to you, Beverly, red, a group that looked at the color blue, another group that looked at yellow, and another group that looked at gray. After staring at those colors for 20 to 30 seconds, they would take the four exercises, and there was no change in their performance compared to the control group. The folks that stared at the color green for 20 to 30 seconds had a 25% improvement in their creative performance. Or as I would say to my Duke students, because I learned of this research when I was in the classroom with them, that takes like your B- to an A+ to have a 25% improvement in your performance. So I went out that day and bought myself a green folder. I usually have one close at hand. I'm sorry I don't, to wave it at folks. I went out that day to buy myself a green folder. My office is green. My shirt is green. My water bottle is green. I've just surrounded myself with green ever since then. And so here's what I do. In the morning, I've printed up some green cards. In the morning, I stare at my green card for 20 to 30 seconds. And then at the end of the day, I stare at the green card for 20 to 30 seconds. And I say to myself two things. I say to myself, okay, I'm now more confident because I've improved my performance by 25%. But it also just simply reminds me that I want to be creative and entrepreneurial all throughout the day, right? But the nature of doing that simple little discipline reminds me of the day that I want to have. I want to have a day that I fill the inches and the minutes with as much creative expression as I can find. And so I think that's, you know, so it takes you a minute of your life, of your day rather. It takes you a minute of your day to stare at the color green twice a day. Now, like as you said, when you go out for walks in nature, you become more creative. Well, I've always taken my problems out for walks in the woods as well. I thought it was the walk in the woods that was causing me to be more creative. Well, it's a walk in a green environment, because the researchers say we don't know why it's green. We don't know why green is the only color that has this impact. Others have speculated, and I'm part of that speculative group that says if you look out the window wherever you are, the color of growth is green. And the most basic growth process that occurs on the planet, photosynthesis, is about creating green. somebody else raised their hand in one of my workshops and said that your eye can detect more shades of green than any other color. So there's a couple of little observations about green that sort of reinforce that, it makes sense that it would be green, but the researchers don't proclaim why they think green is the singular color that has this impact. You earlier said before we started that red has that impact on you. If folks feel like there's a different color than green that really makes them feel just right about themselves, that color is probably having a good impact on your creativity. And so I would urge you to continue to enjoy that color that's having that impact on.
Well, I don't wake up staring at red and I don't go to bed staring at red at night. So I don't know. I mean, it's just that, I guess when I wear outfits that are red, that gives me power, and that gives me a sense of confidence. And, I feel like I can take on the world when I wear red. Now, I'm certainly now going to see green. And it's so interesting because I want to show you this, if I can grab it without making too much of a mess here as far as like everything else stumbling down. So someone gave me this. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes. She believes she could. Yeah.
Yes. So this is the only green I actually have in my office other than my weights. I have some weights in there. Right. But I live by this motto.
Well, what a great motto to be wrapped around in green. That seems like the perfect green motto.
Yeah, I live by this because I've always believed it. So just go out and do it. So yeah, now this is what I will stare at.
Right.
Day in and day out. Now you got me hooked. All right. So what is the name of the website again?
Being Better Than Before.
.com.
BetterThanBefore.com. Correct.
Okay. Perfect.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, Carl, this has absolutely been a delightful interview. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it as well.
I learned a lot in just a short period of time, and I'm sure that anyone who is viewing this podcast will learn something as well. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Boomer Beat. Remember this, until next time, stay empowered along your journey. See ya.
Good news you can use for your life.